Thank you very much, Charlie, and thank you, Grant Rosenberg, for organizing this wonderful occasion. Je suis vraiment honoré de la présence de tellement d'amis de très longue date. This room is full of people without whom this book never would have been possible. And part of the reason that it's so full is that so many of us came over from New York this week to celebrate Laura de Gramont's 39th birthday. So I'm very grateful that Laura is here and all of her friends are here, many of whom are my friends too. But there are a few other people here who I have to single out because I really couldn't have written the book without them. At the top of the list is Claire Andria, a fantastic historian who also happens to be the daughter of André Boulloche, a very important character in my book, and the man who in fact recruited the Boulloche, André Boulloche, into the resistance at the end of 1940. And Claire opened the doors of the National Archives and gave me endless, indispensable advice. Is Mathilde here? She's supposed to be here. Mathilde Demoiselle was the assistant to Christiane Audibert when she wrote her own book about her experiences. And most of all, we have among us François and Pierre Audibert, who are the sons of Christiane Boulloche Audibert, the star of the book, who is still very much alive and well and living in the 16th, and who I will see again tomorrow. I first met François and Pierre on my first trip to France in 1962, and the reason our two families were united was because my uncle Henry Kaiser, a great man, a labor lawyer in Washington, D.C., who represented the musicians and the bakers, but in 1944 he was a lieutenant in the United States Army and the labor advisor to the occupying United States Army. And Christiane and her sister Jacqueline were living in their parents' large and mostly empty apartment, and they saw an ad in the newspaper seeking housing for U.S. Army officers and took my uncle in rent-free for a year in gratitude to the Allies. And my uncle wrote home to his new wife Paula and said, "I'm living in an apartment in Paris with two very attractive French girls." And his wife wrote back, "Is there anyone else there?" And my uncle wrote back, "Yes, there's also a very attractive French maid." Well, Christiane and her brother André, after the war, went to America for a year, and my parents met them for the first time then. And after that, whenever we were in France or they were in America, we made sure to see each other. And I heard the stories of what had happened to the Boulloche sisters from my Uncle Henry because he'd heard them when they were brand new. And he told them to me and to his other nephews and nieces because they were the most extraordinary stories that anybody had ever known. And really from the time that I became a writer, I knew that this was a book, I feel like I'm stepping on tours, this was a book that I would write one day. But Christiane and Jacqueline and André never spoke about what had happened to them during the war for 50 years because it was so painful. So in fact, there were details that I had learned from my Uncle Henry that her own children would not learn until really the end of the 1990s, when Christiane wrote 40 pages for her grandchildren about this subject, a book which became my takeoff point. So this was really a story preserved for 50 years through oral history. But what was remarkable was that when I began to do archival research, everything that Christiane had remembered was true. My two main sources in the archival department were the National Archives of France, which is which Claire Andria led me into, which I discovered there was an oral history commissioned by the French government of the resistance immediately after the war, where they sent people out to interview anyone who had been in the resistance, including André Boulloche. And it was indexed in such a way that I could find all of the interviews in which the Boulloche family was mentioned. So all of the major events of the book were also in these archives. And then I discovered that at the British National Archive, if, like André Boulloche and André Boulloche and several other characters in the book, you had been to England during the war, the first thing that happened to you when you arrived in England in wartime was that you were sent to something called Patriotic School, which had been set up by British intelligence to figure out whether you were a sheep or a goat. If you were the one, sheep, that meant you were the real deal, an actual resistor, and if you were a goat, it meant you were a double agent. And it's interesting to know that they tortured one prisoner at the very beginning, and then realized immediately that this was a completely counterproductive way of getting information, and the British, during World War II, at least at this particular institution, never tortured anyone again because they realized they were much more likely to get reliable information without any torture. Anyway, I found out that if I could show that André Boulloche and the other characters in the book were dead, then their files were automatically declassified. And what happened to you at patriotic school was that you were interviewed for about 6 hours a day for about 5 days in a row. And you had to tell everything that you had done during the war, both chronologically and thematically. So this was an incredible resource for me because I got André's own recollection of everything that he had done from 1940 to 1942. André is recruited by Claire's father, André Boulloche, at the end of 1940, after he's attempted to recruit André's older brother, who's an inspector in the finance ministry. And André's older brother says, "No, I'm not interested in that, but you talk to my little brother and he'll come right in," who worked for the Department of Bridges and Highways. And indeed, André did come right in, and because he was working for the Department of Bridges and Highways just north of Paris, he was able to collect all kinds of information about German troop movements, which was then laboriously relayed to London. And at the end of 1942, he's tipped off that the Gestapo is about to arrest him, and he goes over, on the day after Christmas, he goes over the Pyrenees to Spain, where he's arrested, escaped, eventually makes contact with the British consul in Madrid, who gets him to Lisbon in May of 1943, and he flies to England in June of 1943. He passes muster at patriotic school, goes to Paris, and meets one Charles de Gaulle, and tells de Gaulle that he wants to return to France with the invasion at Normandy. And de Gaulle says, "No, you can't wait that long. I need you back in occupied Paris right now. You're going to be my military delegate in Paris. Your job is going to be to coordinate all of the resistance movements in northern France." So in September, André gets on a plane and flies back to France in the Loire Valley. He lands at a secret landing strip. Some people were parachuted in, some people landed. His Lysander landed. He goes to Paris, finds his brother, who still is not in the resistance, but says, "Your sisters are already delivering underground newspapers. They'll be interested." And he makes his sisters his two deputies in September of 1943. And I don't know which direction we have these pictures in. This is the, I think we should lower the lights for a minute, Grant. Yeah. This is the daily parade of the German army down the Champs-Élysées, which they did every day during the long 4-year occupation. That's my uncle Henry Kaiser in about 1940, a handsome man. And these are the street signs which Christian recalled very specifically, black on yellow, which defiled every Paris corner with these German accents for 4 years. And that says, "French and German workers unite." And this, of course, was the great inspiration for the resistance, especially in the later years of the war, when the Vichy government began to send hundreds of thousands of French young men to Germany to work in German factories, and to avoid this unpleasant duty, many of them went into the countryside and joined the Maquis and the resistance. Here we have at the top with the pipe, this is at Aix, the University of Aix, the famous school, and at the top with the pipe is the star of our show, André Boulloche, and to his immediate left is Claude Rodinei, who was his successor as the military delegate in Paris for Charles de Gaulle. This is the house in Fontainebleau where Christiane and her mother and her sister go to live from 1940 to 1941 after they've evacuated Paris. This is a letter from Jacques Boulloche, the father, to his wife on 15th of June 1940 as the Germans are arriving in France, and it says, "Tout est fini, nous verrons plus." Will we ever see, everything is finished, will we ever see each other again? One of my most magnificent sources was Agnes Boulloche, André's daughter, who really had every conceivable family document going back to 1905. And this is in the French National Assembly. I can't say for sure if these are members of the National Assembly or interlopers, but they've just listened to the rebroadcast of the speech of Adolf Hitler, and they are showing their fealty to their new leader. And this is where W.H. Smith was before World War II, and W.H. Smith is again after World War II, but during the war it was a German bookstore. This is Jacques Boulloche, the patriarch of the family, who is the director of the Bureau of Highways and the Department of Public Works, and his wife Hélène. Christiane hates this picture. She assures me her mother was a very attractive woman, but this is the only picture that they could find for me. And this is Robert Boulloche, the oldest son. And there is André Postel-Vinet, the man who recruited them into the resistance and who wrote his own extraordinary memoir called Un fou s'échappe. And another thing that I couldn't have done without Claire Andrieux is her permission to quote vast amounts of André's extraordinary escape story from a prison, which he's in a mental, he's being interviewed, he's pretending to be crazy, and he's sent to a German psychiatrist who realizes very quickly that he's only pretending to be crazy. This is after he's tried to kill himself by flinging himself down into a courtyard, 2 stories, and he breaks almost every bone in his body, but he doesn't kill himself. And he's gradually sort of, gets back to health, although he still walks with enormous difficulty. And after he's interviewed by this psychiatrist, he's sitting in a waiting room outside, and he sees a garden, and everybody else in the waiting room is a prisoner at the hospital, which he's only visiting. And they are in striped uniforms, and he is in a civilian suit. And he walks to the door where there's a German soldier, and the German soldier makes no effort to stop him. So he continues past the German soldier and says to himself, "Ah, sainted German discipline, they're only supposed to stop the ones in the striped suits," and walks out into the garden and out into the street without anyone stopping him after he's been in jail. And the first thing that happens is he runs into 3 children and says, "Hi kids, I'm a prisoner of the Germans, I just escaped, but I don't have any money, can you give me enough to get on the metro?" And the kids look at him like he's out of his mind, but they reach into their pockets and give him just enough money to buy 1 metro ticket. And there's Rodinei, who's the successor to André Boulloche as the military delegate. And here we have on the upper right is Alex Catlama, second from right, and he was on the national basketball team of France before the war, and eventually comes back to France to be in the resistance, and Christiane is the one who greets him, but her sister Jacqueline is the one he falls in love with and eventually marries. And these are German officers being paraded through the streets after the liberation of Paris. And now I will read you a little bit. It is a few minutes before 4 on a gray Paris afternoon, January 12, 1944, when the black Citroën Traction Avant pulls up in front of a drab apartment building in the Rue de la Santé on the left bank. The low-slung front-wheel drive Citroën is famous as the getaway car for French gangsters, but now it has acquired a more menacing pedigree. It is the official automobile of the German secret police. 2 Gestapo agents in black leather raincoats jump out onto the sidewalk. They pull a single prisoner, a short 20-year-old Frenchman named Jacques, out of the car after them. The youth's nearly limp body broadcasts defeat, but he shows no obvious marks of a beating. 2.5 miles away, a swastika sways in the wind atop the Eiffel Tower. It is the 1,308th day of the Nazi occupation of Paris. Dozens of other swastikas defile the French capital. Below them, street signs written in German punctuate the avenues with unfamiliar accents. humiliating Parisians at every carrefour. The city's best restaurants like Maxime's and the Tour d'Argent are still flourishing, but now their customers are mostly German officers and their young French companions. Starvation rations for the French have transformed apartment terraces into rabbit farms as the urban dawn is oddly heralded by roosters. More fortunate Parisians rely upon the generosity of country cousins who have much more access to food. Daytime Paris echoes to the sound of shoes with wooden soles clip-clopping down its narrow streets and grand avenues. If an old pair of shoes needs a new sole, you can't do anything about it because there is no leather, said Pierre Mendès France. It's very difficult to describe what life is like in a country where everyone spends all of their time looking for things. The nightly blackout means the only authorized light outdoors is the eternal flame under the Arc de Triomphe. Electricity and gas are both erratic. Heated apartments, a dimly remembered luxury from 1940. Only 7,000 cars circulate on the streets of the City of Light, many of them converted to run on wood. They are called gazogènes. 2 million bicycles are the best way to get around, but a good bicycle can cost 10,000 francs, almost as much as a car did before the war. The only taxis are pedicabs pedaled by bicycle riders or taxi hippomobile pulled by a single horse. The fastest pedicab is propelled by veterans of the Tour de France. Bicycle power also keeps the movie theaters open. 4 men pedaling a generator at 13 miles an hour for 6 hours can produce enough reliable electricity for 2 full shows. Jews and communists are the first victims of the occupation, but the dangers of resisting the Nazis are escalating for everyone at the beginning of 1944. Huge yellow posters plastered on the walls of the metro proclaim that members of the resistance are no longer the only ones facing German firing squads. A new edict ordains that their fathers, cousins, and in-laws will be executed as well. And yet, in January, there is a new uncertainty bubbling underneath the humid winter air. All across Nazi Europe, the occupied are buoyed and the occupiers menaced by the event that everyone knows is coming, but no one knows exactly when or where, the Allied invasion of the Nazi-ruled continent. Across the English Channel, massive numbers of British, American, Canadian, and French troops are gathering on the southern coast of England, where Dwight Eisenhower is making the plans for a spectacular invasion. Thanks to a huge disinformation campaign, its location remains a secret 6 months before the assault begins. After 4 years of war, a cautiously optimistic Churchill believes the biggest danger now facing the Allies is stalemate rather than defeat. Yesterday, the young prisoner accompanying his German captors was a proud member of the resistance. Today, he is leading the German agents to the secret address he had sworn to conceal so they can arrest his boss, André Boulloche, a man he worships. If André is really there, the Germans have promised Jacques he will be rewarded with his freedom. But should he believe that? Jacques is young-looking even for his age. Especially today, he looks almost like a little boy. Deeply religious, he's joined the resistance just 3 months earlier after being recruited by his Sorbonne classmate, André's sister, Christiane. Christiane has no trouble persuading him to join. When she asks if he wants to work for her brother, the boy signs up immediately without hesitation or reflection. Jacques is the same age as Christiane, who turned 20 at the end of 1943. Christiane is smart, strong, and attractive. She also has a prominent nose that she thinks is unattractive. She worries, perhaps, it makes her less glamorous looking than her older sister Jacqueline, who has joined the resistance with her. Christiane's clandestine duties require her to ride her bicycle all over Paris, sometimes as much as 60 miles a day, picking up telegrams from secret dropping points, decoding them, transporting forbidden radio equipment, and sometimes smuggling guns through the capital, usually in a basket underneath eggs or vegetables. All Boulloches share an innate sense of duty. When Christiane returns from the countryside after the armistice to find German soldiers goose-stepping through Paris, she is consumed by a single thought: this is wrong. Before this war started, she had been certain we wouldn't just resist them, we would beat them. That's why the occupation was a thunderclap. Coupled with youthful fearlessness and hero worship of her brother, that simple notion, this is wrong, propels her into the underground fight against the Germans. She is hypnotized and horrified by the occupation. It swallows all of her attention. The Boulloche sisters' first act of resistance occurs when they are stopped by 2 German soldiers on Avenue du Président Wilson. When the young Germans asked for directions to the Place de la Concorde, the girls cheerfully dispatched them in the opposite direction. There is no heat at the lycée, and Christiane wears gloves to turn the pages of the classroom dictionary. She is upset when one of her Jewish teachers loses her job, but she does not consider the plight of the Jews to be the most important thing. More than anything else, it is instinctive patriotism that pushes her into battle. When the Germans are finally driven out of France, everyone's nightmare will be over, or so she believes. As 1944 begins, her brother, André François Roger Jacques Boulloche, has been back in France for only 4 months. He is an engineer, a lawyer, and something of an adventurer. He and his sisters come from many generations of Catholic judges and prominent civil servants. Iconoclasm is a leitmotif in their family. 2 Boulloche ancestors were members of the Cour de Cassation, the highest court at the turn of the century. Both of them, remarkably, had been pro-Dreyfus, a belief that had made them strangers to their class because they were partisans of the truth. 4 months earlier, in the second week of September 1943, André is taken off from England under a nearly full moon with 7 other passengers and a single-engine Westland Lysander. Many underground fighters are parachuted, but the plane carrying this group touches down on a secret landing strip in the Loire Valley. These landings are dangerous because there is always the possibility the Germans have been tipped off. This one has been organized by Jean-François Clouet de Perruche, who has arrived the night before from London, and it goes off without a hitch. Resistance members outline the tiny runway with flashlights pointed straight up at the sky. Foil extends over the tops of their torches to make them invisible to everyone except the airplane circling above them. André is a handsome 28-year-old with brown hair, thick eyebrows that hover over a permanent glint in his eye. Nearly 6 feet tall, he walks with a tempered, youthful swagger. Before the war, he was considered something of a dandy. André has been ordered back to France by Charles de Gaulle to be the general's personal military delegate in Paris. Pseudonym Armand, codename Hypotenuse, André's charge from the renegade general is to bring some order to the burgeoning resistance movements now operating in 11 different departments in northern France. During André's absence from France in 43, there has been a dramatic increase in the membership of the resistance. In the fall of 42, the Vichy government has taken one of its most unpopular steps, shipping off 200,000 Frenchmen to work in Germany. But with so many German soldiers fighting on so many different fronts, that isn't nearly enough slave labor to satisfy the voracious appetite of the Nazi war machine. In February 43, Vichy makes an even bigger blunder and inaugurates the Service du Travail Obligatoire, which requires all Frenchmen between the ages of 18 and 20 to work in Germany for 2 years. Faced with the prospect of forced deportation, thousands of these young men simply disappear into the mountains, where by June they have vastly increased the number of résistants. They and their place of refuge both become known by a Corsican word for mountainous scrubland, maquis. As one historian put it, the concept did not exist in January, it was everywhere by June of 43. In September of 43, after a 9-month absence, André is returned to France on that Lysander, carrying 500,000 French francs in cash. And like everyone in the resistance arriving from England, he also carries a cyanide pill in his pants pocket. It will stay there always unless he is arrested. When he touches it with his index finger, it feels like insurance against torture, or perhaps like his destiny. Either way, he knows he will swallow it if he is captured by the Germans. In this period, the average life of an agent is just 4 months before he is arrested. A certain fatalism fuels André's fearlessness. I never felt the slightest hesitation on his part, said his sister Christiane. But there is one irony that probably escapes him. The only thing that might impinge on his heroism might be his own survival. Now, in January 1944, André is inside his secret headquarters on the top floor of an apartment building on the left bank. With him are his right hand, Charles Gampel, and his assistant, Genevieve. Gampel has arrived 1 month earlier, carrying another 100,000 francs from England. During his brief time in Paris, he has already set up an excellent liaison organization with the Southern Zone. Because their junior aide, Jacques, has been absent for only 1 day, neither Boulloche nor Gampel suspects that he has been arrested. They certainly haven't imagined that Jacques has violated the cardinal principle of the resistance. No matter how badly you were tortured, you must try with all your might not to divulge anything important for 48 hours after your arrest. After you've been missing for 2 days, Your comrades are supposed to assume you've been arrested and relocate to a new clandestine location. Only then, after the captured agent has endured 2 days of unimaginable affliction, is he authorized to tell everything he knows. If the system works the way it's supposed to, by then, his information should be worthless anyway. Jacques adores his boss, André, but almost immediately after he is grabbed by the Germans, the young agent realizes he will never be able to remain silent. He sees only one way out. In a small cell with another Frenchman, he whispers, "Strangle me so I won't talk. If you don't, I will tell them everything." But the boy's cellmate is incapable of providing such grisly mercy. Soon after that, the young Sorbonne student begins to give up all of his secrets, including the location of André's apartment. Barely an hour later, Jacques is squeezing into the narrow elevator in the apartment house on the Rue de la Santé on the left bank with 2 Gestapo agents. When it reaches the 5th floor, the 3 men exit silently onto the landing. Jacques has been brought here to perform the secret knock. The young Frenchman points at the door of the doomed apartment, then walks toward it to carry out his sordid duty. One sharp rap of his fist, a beat, then 2 softer knocks on the door. Inside the apartment, André recognizes the cloak and dagger sequence and stands up from his desk. When he opens the door, he sees 2 Germans in black leather raincoats pointing identical Walter PPK pistols at his heart. "Hands up," they shout. "What's going on?" André screams back. Instinct propels the Frenchman toward the staircase as the Germans open fire. 2 bullets strike the resistance fighter just below the chest. One agent rushes towards him to check for a weapon as the other one storms the apartment to capture his Confederates. If he had not been wounded, André thinks this part would have been easy. He would have swallowed the fatal cyanide pill right away. But now he is writhing on the floor with blood spurting out of his stomach, and the pill never leaves his pocket. For a very long time, you will wonder whether this has been the right decision. Back on the sidewalk in front of the apartment building, the German agents shove André into the back seat of the black Citroën next to Jacques. Then they speed away through the darkening streets of the Paris dust. Jacques is in a state of total collapse. He is weeping and howling and begging his boss for forgiveness. For the rest of his life, André will carry a hideous memory of these moments. This part of André's trauma ends a few minutes later when he is dumped off at La Salpêtrière, which the Germans have taken over as a prison hospital where his wounds will be operated on. For the moment, the Gestapo prefer to keep André alive because they won't be able to torture him unless they first make an effort to nurse him back to some semblance of health. Despite his promised reward, Jacques is soon shipped off to Germany, where he will die in a concentration camp. For just 1 hour, the Gestapo leave the secret apartment unoccupied and unwatched. 45 minutes have passed since the first German team has departed with André and his betrayer. Now Jacqueline, André's sister and Confederate, is at the apartment's front door. She is there to make dinner because, naturally, the women are expected to cook. In pre-war France, women don't even have the right to vote, a privilege de Gaulle will finally bestow upon them after the liberation. Jacqueline performs the secret knock. Hearing no answer, she lets herself in with her own key. At first, the empty apartment does not make her anxious. Gradually, she senses a certain disarray, but if there is blood on the floor of the hallway, she hasn't noticed it. She walks into the kitchen, begins to peel some potatoes, strikes a match to light a fire beneath them, then realizes she is missing a vital part of the meal. One immutable fact of Parisian life has not been altered by the Nazi occupation. Frenchmen still require wine with their dinner. So she leaves the potatoes simmering on the stove, walks out the front door, skips the elevator, bounces down 5 flights, walks around the corner to the neighborhood épicerie, buys a few more groceries and the vital bottle of vin rouge. She will always remember this as the best timed shopping trip of her life. When she returns to the apartment house, she notices something out front that was not there 4 minutes earlier, another black Citroën Traction Avant. She tiptoes into the apartment. Passengers from the car out front have just closed the door of the elevator behind them. Now it is only 1 floor above her. Her body stiffens as she watches the wooden cabin rise slowly through the narrow open shaft. 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. Finally, it stops at the 5th floor where her potatoes are cooking. Later, she will wonder what the Gestapo think when they see those potatoes on top of the stove, but right now, she is already sprinting toward the metro. I have to save my sister. That is her only thought. Most of the time, Jacqueline and Christian don't know where they are during the day, but today Jacqueline happens to know. Her sister has taken the afternoon off to listen to some Bach at the Palais de Chaillot. But the concert hall is on the right bank at Trocadero, 14 metro stops away. Jacqueline sprints 800 yards to the Metro Glacier. She is pretty enough to turn heads any time, but the sight of her racing through the metro, arms full of groceries, makes her uncomfortably conspicuous. She is out of breath when she reaches the platform, just as the train, Direction Étoile, pulls into the station. The train's doors close behind her. Then the trip seems to take forever. D'Enfer, Rochelaure, Raspail, Montparnasse, Pasteur, still 7 more stops to go. Jacqueline is not religious, but she is praying anyway, praying she will somehow be able to intercept her sister before she returns to the secret apartment where the second wave of the Gestapo is now waiting to capture both of them. But can she possibly get there before the concert ends? And even if she arrives before the final notes, how will she ever be able to pick her sister out of the crowd? She has no idea where Christiane is sitting. Palais de Chaillot is one of the biggest concert halls in Paris. Now the train is rumbling out of its underground tunnel to travel over the Seine to Passy. Just 1 more stop to go, then it dives back underground to pull into Trocadero. Jacqueline knows every inch of the station. It is the one she grew up with, the one closest to her parents' apartment. She runs toward the exit for the Palais de Chaillot. Now she is dashing past the statues of Apollo and Hercules. As she enters the lobby, she can just make out the sounds of Bach still seeping out of the hall. I haven't missed the end of the performance, but how will she ever be able to snatch Christiane out of the crowd? Happy accident or intuition? To the end of her life, Christiane will never be able to answer that question. Before today, she has never left a concert early, but today, something suddenly makes her stand up to leave the hall 10 minutes before the concert has ended. When she reaches the empty lobby, she walks straight into the arms of her frantic sister. We can't leave by the front door. That is Jacqueline's only greeting. She thinks the Gestapo may have followed her here. Deciding they have nothing left to lose, they approach the box office. Jacqueline says to the ticket seller she must speak to the manager. He may betray them, but they see no other choice. When he appears, Jacqueline exclaims, "We can't leave by the front door, nothing more." The manager looks at her silently. His face reveals nothing. Now he will save them or turn them over to the Germans. He walks around, walks out of the box office, then he leads the terrified but still very attractive young women to the stage door. Jacqueline repays his kindness by thrusting the groceries and the bottle of wine she has carried halfway through Paris into his hands. They will only slow them down now anyway. Outside, they scour the street for Gestapo men, but no one looks particularly menacing. Thank you very much.
Questions for Charlie?
Yes, please, questions, I hope. This is a very complicated subject, as you know, and it is one that I discuss in the book. The fact of the matter is that France has gone through many phases of dealing and not dealing with what happened during the war. And initially, de Gaulle, for strategic reasons, really, pretends that, at least in public, not in private, but in public, that everyone had been part of the resistance. And that is kind of the accepted general wisdom. The only real Frenchmen, the only real France were the ones, part of the France that resisted, is what de Gaulle says in his first speech in Paris immediately after it's liberated. And this really lasts until about 1968-69, when 2 things happen. Marcel Ophuls leads the strike at the national TV channel during the uprisings of 1968 and loses the strike and therefore loses his job and has to do something else. So he decides to make a movie about France under the occupation, which is The Sorrow and the Pity, perhaps the finest documentary of the 20th century. And that begins the first, that is one of the first really honest films about what life was like and how France was severely divided, of course, between the collaborators and the resistors. And then around the same time, Robert Paxton, the great Columbia historian, using mostly German archives, reveals the extent of Vichy collaboration. It's true that there were people who pretended that they were in the resistance. It's also true that there were summary executions of perhaps 10,000 people who had been collaborators immediately after the war. So no, I don't think that the people who were truly heroic like André, were sullied by the others. But one of the reasons I wrote this book is that Americans, at least Americans who don't live in Paris, are routinely dismissive of the way France behaved during the war, not realizing A, that there were many people like the Boulloches who fought, and B, that there were not only hundreds of thousands of troops who died in the initial invasion in 1940, but also hundreds of thousands of civilians who died, some in retaliation for the heroic acts of the resistance. And Dwight Eisenhower, in his memoirs, makes a big point of saying that the success of the Normandy invasion owed a great deal to the fact that the resistance carried out 1,000 acts of sabotage in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, blowing up railroad lines and severing long-distance telephone lines and doing all kinds of things. And he said this was the equivalent of having several additional divisions to help him. I think that's a very high Polish estimate. Well, Claire, what do you think of that? 60% polonais, qu'est-ce que tu penses?
Well, go into the Newsweek Daily Beast website.
Well, Newsweek is not absolutely infallible, even though I used to work for it in its previous incarnation. It's not infallible, I warn you.
But go and get the article.
Okay. Well, a lot of them were sent to a single camp in England, which was bugged by the British. And it was because they were sent to that camp, which was bugged, that the Allies were able to collect proof that all of the top generals were intimately familiar with all of the war crimes that had been committed by the Nazis, because they talked about what had happened and they talked about what they knew. And in fact, the last general who was in charge of the German garrison in Paris talked about how frightful it had been, how they'd been simple robbers, how they'd shipped off everything that they could from Paris back to Germany. I should show the rest of the pictures, by the way, while we're at it. That's a tank in front of Notre Dame the day that de Gaulle speaks at Notre Dame immediately after the liberation of Paris. This is a postcard. You could, even when you were in a concentration camp, you were allowed to send one letter a month to your parents. And André Boulloche's first postcard actually arrives in June of 1944, just before the liberation, and that's the first time that they know that he's still alive after he's shipped off to Auschwitz in April of 1944. And André, in fact, survives 3 concentration camps, comes back, and this is what he looks like immediately after the concentration camp. And he becomes a socialist in the camps, and he becomes Ramadier's chief of cabinet immediately after the war, and de Gaulle's Minister of Education in 1958, and by 1978, he's the chief spokesman for the Socialist Party and the mayor of a little town on the border with Germany, and he's poised to become the first socialist finance minister in the post-war period when he takes a little Piper Cub to make a campaign speech for a colleague 100 miles away. And he makes the speech, gets back on the plane with a 21-year-old pilot, and they go up, and there's a sudden storm, and they get lost in the storm. And this man who's survived 3 German concentration camps crashes in the Black Forest of Germany, survives the crash, walks down the snow-covered mountain 200 yards, and then dies in the snow. And there's a funeral for 5,000 people. Mitterrand is the main speaker, plus 2 German ministers are also speakers, or a German minister and a German mayor, because this man who spent a year in 3 different concentration camps devotes most of his public life after that to reconciliation between France and Germany. A very remarkable man. This is Jacqueline Boulloche and her fiancé Alex Catlama in about 1945 or 46. These are the 2 sisters, that's Jacqueline on the left and Christiane on the right, also around 1946. This is the memorial for half of the family. The half of the family which did not join the resistance are the ones who paid the consequences, hence the cost of courage. That's Jacqueline again with her firstborn, Eric Catlama. And this is the memorial that they erected to their family in Père Lachaise, which is still there, you can see it. And I got the family, the last thing I did when I was living here to do the research for the book was I asked the family to assemble once more at Père Lachaise as they had for every year for about 10 years, from roughly 1956 to 66, on the anniversary of the death of their mother, whose the date of her death in a concentration camp had been written down by the Germans. And André would get up and say, remember that your grandparents and your uncle died for the liberty of France. They were killed by the Nazis. And then he would give each grandchild one red rose to place on that esophagus, and they would go back and have lunch together, and then they would spend the next 364 days not talking about what had happened during the war. That's Christiane. Now, the way she looked about the time I first met her, around 1962, and that's de Gaulle, and at the far right is André Boulloche, probably at the time that he was Minister of Education, and I think they are participating in some kind of commemoration of the resistance. And that's what André Boulloche looked like in 1978. And that is the greatest moment of closure I've ever had. That's me, exactly 1 year ago, handing a galley of the book to Christiane, who didn't expect to see it until 6 months later on the publication date. And that, in that big French limousine, is Charles de Gaulle liberating Paris in August of 1944. We have one more question. Yes, Seuil is going to publish it in 1 year. We would have to get it translated, but it will. And I'm meeting my French editor. exciting moment. I'm meeting my French editor for the first time on Monday. So yes. And the movie rights are available. Thank you very much.